Well, actually, I should probably give it to you to like give us our cold open, right? Since this is your baby, basically.
Oh man, I know. We were supposed to talk about the trickster today, but I'd rather talk about men in leotards,
Yeah. So,
as is my want. So
well,
I put down the executive decision.
and I gotta say, I gotta appreciate how much like when he applies himself. Everybody, I'm like the parent teacher conference right now. It's like when Jacob just
Yeah.
applies himself, he can do amazing things. When it comes to
Hey,
preparation, when it comes to planning, when it comes to outlining, it's unbelievable.
Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
So what is the kind of special reason? Why are we kind of putting a pause on our trickster episode? Because we do talk about how, this is part 1 of 2, and we're going to talk about some more of the trickster stuff, and we still will. It's just going to be put next week. We're producing this special timely episode, or we're recording it because what's the significance?
we have tricked you yet again
Oh,
in the context of our trickster episodes.
please just get to it.
Yes, okay. My wife pointed out earlier that, like last week, that the 18th of this month is going to be Superman's anniversary. I believe it's the anniversary of his first appearance in Action Comics.
What year?
Though now
What
I
year
can't quite
anniversary?
remember. 1930.
I meant like, don't give me a math problem.
Oh,
Is it
oh.
100 years? Is it 90 years? Is it 80 years?
Well,
I thought you said
shoot,
80
I
last time
wasn't
we were
that
talking.
prepared. I mean, how prepared do you want me to be, Mike? I gave you a little. Now you're taking a mile here. I don't know. 1930 something.
Well,
19.
it's
So
probably
whatever. He's
33, right?
90.
No, it says 38. So what does that put us at?
Oh,
85?
we have that.
85 years?
Oh, yep, 85. You know what? That sounds correct too.
So
Very good, sir. All right, so 85-year anniversary, and it's on the 18th, which happens to be the day that this episode is dropping. It's almost like we planned it at the last minute. Nevertheless, we planned it. And so we are going to talk about Superman today because I wanted to. But don't you worry, the trickster will return like a 007 credit, at the end of the Bond movies. 007 will return. Trickster will return in
I
whatever we call the
thought you were
second
I thought you were
Trickster
going for
episode.
like the Marvel post credits, because it always says after the post credits like
Like a stinger.
Captain America will return in blah 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 or something like that. So
Does it? Well, they ripped that off of 007.
probably.
Don't tell me you're not a long and storied fan of the 007 franchise.
I mean,
Mike.
I've watched a handful of them. I'm like,
Oh,
I'm pretty
boy.
ambivalent to it. Like,
We're gonna have to fix that.
I watched them probably when I was too young as a kid, like with my, well, anyway, just
James Bond, that paragon of Christian virtue,
yeah.
and you're ambivalent?
Yeah,
You're the guy that loves Game of Thrones. So, I mean, James Bond is downright,
Look, as is my want,
wholesome,
Jacob,
wholesome.
as is my want, I'm sure I could find something redemptive in it. I just haven't bothered to look hard enough. So yeah, you can find something to argue with me about, something redemptive in the James Bond, what would you call that? Like universe, James Bondiverse, but
Sure. James Bondiverse.
but
Sure.
that's not what we're talking about today, is it? So
no. All right. Well, I guess since it's my episode, I should probably be the one that tries to keep us on track. Is that what you're telling me?
Sure. So it's a Superman episode, but I want to say first and foremost that this is not just another Superman is a figure of Jesus podcast or a Superman is a figure of Jesus episode. Well, that may be true. That's not going to be like the main thrust. I mean, there might be some elements. We might have some crossover to that. And there's inevitably going to be, because actually when you look at it from a Jewish perspective or a Christian perspective, Superman was originally intended to be a messianic figure whom Christians just recognize as Jesus.
Sure.
I remember this was kind of a big, when I first saw this, that he was created by Jewish artists, Jewish authors, and
True.
it was supposed to be this sort of Jewish messianic figure. I think they even relate him to Moses, sort of. If you think there's a lot of Moses imagery, well, conveniently
Comes on a
enough,
spaceship, lands in a foreign land,
Well, yeah.
gets adopted by the locals,
well, yeah, the
rises
whole
up to save the people.
and I think even the ship is resembling a sort of like the wicker basket kind of motif and stuff.
Really depends upon what version of the ship you're looking at. I'd have to look back at the old 30s comic and see how they drew it.
Well, and it
One of the
also
Wager
just
just kinda looks
resembles
like
a
one of
spaceship.
those-
But the idea is conveniently enough for Christians, well, who happens
You're
to
just
be
saying.
a fulfillment.
You're just saying it looks like a wicker basket.
Uh,
Because if you just put that in people's minds,
Uh-huh.
they'll fill in the gaps,
well,
right?
that's because symbolism's meaningless, right? We just invent our meaning. Isn't that the postmodern assumption that we're supposed
right.
to take into this?
Sure.
We haven't done that episode yet, Jacob. We are on a hero's journey still. We haven't deconstructed that myth yet.
I just like how you said we're not going to make this as a Superman is Jesus episode, and then you proceeded to talk about how Superman is Jesus.
Well,
for-
we're getting that out of the way. We're pulling that Band-Aid off because that's too basic for us, Jacob. We're going for that
too
deep
basic
dive,
for
deep
us.
cut. And
We're the deep cut type.
so, and again, inevitably, a lot of the stuff that, when you kind of propose, like it's going to be talking about the dying God and why it keeps coming back. So there is going to be Jesus stuff that comes in, but we just wanted to kind of address that right away, that it's like, oh, this isn't going to be some, gotcha surprise that Superman's similar to Jesus. We already know that. Okay. We already get
Besides, everyone knows Batman is Jesus. We covered that in 3 episodes.
That's okay. Well, specific elements. That's fine.
Yeah, no. It is true. Superman is the most deified of superheroes for sure.
Well, and
as such is
that
is very
assumption is
Jesus-y.
important to this conversation, right? Because that's kind of why you
Well,
brought
it
this
is.
up.
Yeah, well, let me talk about that a little bit, because I was actually thinking about just as it happens, I was thinking about the fact that there is just an awful lot of death and resurrection Superman stories. I was sitting there on a lark. I started rewatching All-Star Superman, the animated film. It's on HBO Max. Check it out. It's pretty good. It's based upon a comic. And it's like, man, this is like the 4th version of Superman dying that I can, just rattle off the top of my head. And I was like, that's kind of funny, because, we're in the Easter season. And it's that type of idea.
Gods are
resurrections
dying
in the
all
air
over
and
the
things like
gods
that.
are dying left and right.
That's
To
right.
quote to
It's just
paraphrase Game
everywhere.
of Thrones. Yeah.
It's everywhere.
Well,
Yeah.
we
and
also
so
did
I
just
was
do
like,
our
yeah, it's
Underworld
funny.
episode. We just recorded the Underworld episode too.
We did, because again, that's this idea. So, it was just kind of, it occurred to me. It's like, man, there's just so many stories that have been told about, relatively speaking, of Superman dying, right? And it's like, that's kind of funny how people just keep going back to that well. Like they just keep mining that, and kind of wringing it for all it's worth, kind of thing, from a commercial's perspective. But then it's like, that's funny. Then when my wife brought up the fact that it was Superman's anniversary this month and DC was going to be doing some stuff, I was like, well, shoot. And it's Easter. We got to talk about this.
It's all,
And
the planets
so-
are aligning. Not
That's
Krypton,
right.
not that
All the-
planet, but the other planets.
That
are
one,
still-
yeah. But if it was there, it would have.
Yeah.
So anyway, here's the thing about these Superman stories, and what we'll end up doing is we'll talk about how this goes farther back than Superman, right? Like, obviously we got Jesus, but this idea of dying and resurrecting gods is really prolific throughout human culture. So we're going to get into that, but I want to keep talking initially about these different Superman comics that have been made. And it kind of goes back to 1986. Alan Moore, that wild author from England, created a swan song comic for Superman, because back in the 80s, mid 80s, DC basically consolidated all of its universes into one universe, because after 60 years of comic storytelling, like the storyline was a mess, right? And people are obsessed with canon, and so they wanted there to be like a
we
singular
got to retcon
canon.
some things.
We got to retcon. We got to somehow make it so that there's just one story that everyone fits into. And so they were basically revamping their universe killing it and bringing it back to life.
Ah.
Actually, funnily enough, this is called Crisis on Infinite Earths. Yeah. In this moment, suddenly my brain goes blank, but Crisis on Infinite Earths, I believe. And so, but they wanted to do a final comic within the continuity of that, like prior to that crisis happening, for Superman, kind of like a goodbye Superman comic. And so that's what they did. And let me tell you something. I had never gotten around to reading that comic, so I decided to go purchase a copy and read it for this episode. That is a dark comic, man. It's crazy. Everybody dies.
Everybody wants to throw Zack Snyder under the bus for making DC so dark, but it's been there for 40 years.
Yeah, Alan Moore got there first. Yeah. If you know anything about Alan Moore, he's kind of a dark writer, or at least he's pretty deconstructive. Wow. I mean, for anyone who's already read this comic prior to me, like you really kept the lid on that one.
He kind of looks like Rasputin. It's not to...
and then I shared a photo of the cover for this comic. Now it's a redrawing of the original cover from back in the 80s, but the original cover looks very, very similar to it. But if you look at the modern cover from like the mid 2000s for this comic, Superman looks so passive in it. It's a picture of him flying towards the viewer, away from people like waving goodbye to him on top of the Daily Planet building.
And he's over it.
But his face is so blank. I honestly, as a person who is really invested in icons and theology of icons, my first reaction was, it's remarkable how emotionless Superman is in this image, because that's actually a trait that you see in icons in the Orthodox Church, where they don't sentimentalize the person in the icon, because they don't want, if you're coming to an icon and you're weeping because your mother just died or whatever, you don't want buddy Jesus, kind of like winking and gunning you like from the other side of that icon. Right? Like, like exactly, right?
Yeah.
That's the point.
That's the meme.
So
that's
you want an icon that sits with you no matter what the kind of emotions you're bringing to it are. And so they're kind of intentionally drawn in such a way that their faces are passive, right? Of course, when I showed it to Mike here, he went a completely nihilistic route with it and just said that it looked like Superman had given up on life, and that couldn't overcome the postmodern nihilism.
I wasn't saying Superman
was
had. I was saying that's a reflection of the author, which, to be fair, that is probably accurate.
Tell you what, this is a very old comic. This is almost 40 years old. So,
but to go back to, you were talking about Alan Moore, like he's responsible for V for Vendetta, for Watchmen, for The Killing Joke.
Watchmen.
So if you want to talk about nihilism and so maybe that phrase, whoever wrote that phrase, that's
who's a big purveyor of nihilism? I don't know. We'll have to circle back to that. Actually,
is that ironic because it's the Joker, right? Is that what you were getting at?
Oh no, I thought you were talking about Nietzsche and God is dead.
Oh, hey, look at that! It's all coming full circle.
I know. How about it? Right? We'll get to that. We'll have to return to that. But so anyway, Alan Moore. It's almost like DC was like, man, we like you young British scallywag. Why don't you go ahead and just mess up all of our characters? Hey, in interesting ways. I'm not knocking these stories. They're super interesting, but it's remarkable that DC let Alan Moore tell some of the stories that Alan Moore chose to tell using their properties. It's like, wow, DC, these are bold choices.
The 80s were a wild time, right? Is that kind of the big lesson?
They were a wild time. So at the end, and hey, this is a story. This is the death of Superman. Superman dies, right? So it's not really a spoiler, because all of the stories we're going to talk about. It's the title of the
comic. It's the title of the movie. So I do remember, Superman though, dying. I will say, as a kid, it did really stick out with me seeing the cover of, you've got the cape as the flag kind of thing. It's all torn up. And and I think, isn't there one where like it almost is like you're looking up at the other heroes like you're in a grave? Isn't there another image that
there's a lot of imagery associated with
those
that.
Two really stand out to me. But and like I said, I remember seeing that cover as a kid. Back when,
actually,
because 92 was when the Yeah. And they use that in the movie too. The 2018 animated movie. They use that same image.
Yeah, I had you watch those movies, those cartoons.
Thank you very much to for the listening audience to show that picture that nobody but me could see. That was very
I just
beneficial.
showed him a picture of the image that he's talking about.
Yeah, all you got to do is Google the death of Superman and image search that, and you'll find it. But
it's his cape, like stuck on a piece of like wrought iron sticking out on the ground, like a flag, but it's all torn up.
Show don't tell.
It's
right?
super iconic.
Yeah,
it's
iconic.
Super iconic image. It is, absolutely. Well, let me just quick finish what Alan Moore does to Superman, because it's fascinating. After many deaths, Crypto the dog, they killed the dog. You never killed the dog.
Yeah.
They kill the dog in that comic arc. Wow. Just to give you a taste of what happens here. But anyway, at the end of it, it's basically a story of all of Superman's enemies coming at him, his biggest foes coming at him one final time, right? And they all get dispatched in various ways. So all of his enemies are getting killed off. Lex Luthor gets karate chopped to death, like gets his neck broke because he's possessed by Brainiac, which is a super intelligent Kryptonian computer. And even after he's killed, right, he gets neck broke to death. Brainiac's sitting on top of his head like a helmet. And Brainiac brings his corpse back to life and like uses his corpse to walk around. Yeah.
Yeah.
Whoa.
That'll sit with you. That'll sit with you.
It's
nightmare fuel.
And so anyway, Mr. Mxyzptlk shows up as kind of like the grand orchestrator. And because he's decided he's just going to be like pure evil.
You mean our trickster? Our trickster character,
hey, there
Mr.
you go.
Mxyzptlk?
And that is very true.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But anyway, continue.
Anyway, yeah. So he shows up and Superman can't allow this godlike being to just like turn into like an evil satanic figure, which is what he literally says he's going to do. He's like, I'm bored being mischievous. I've decided I'm just going to be pure evil. And so Superman kills him by kind of tearing him apart using Phantom Zone technology. But then he feels really bad that he killed somebody intentionally like that. And so he goes into a room where there's gold kryptonite. Gold kryptonite's going to take away his powers. And then this is all taking place up at the Fortress of Solitude. And then he walks off into the Arctic to freeze to death. And so 10 years later, the narrative device is that Lois Lane is given an interview to the Daily Planet. And she's like, and that's the last anyone ever saw of Superman. We presume he died out in the Arctic.
That's a very kind of like ending of Frankenstein. Doesn't it kind of remind you of the end of Frankenstein novel?
Yeah.
But anyway, that's a little bit of an aside. So,
in fairness, they make it super clear because Lois Lane's married and has a kid at this point, 10 years later. They make it super clear that Superman actually did not die. So that's the twist. Superman, this is all just a facade that he went to live in seclusion. Very like Dark Knight Rises, like Batman just pretends to die.
The retirement of Superman just doesn't
away.
Have the same ring to it, though.
It doesn't, yeah. And the reason why I still think that we can incorporate it in this episode, even though he technically doesn't die, is that, A, the Superman character does die, right? The whole world thinks he's dead.
Yeah, it's the death of the image of Superman, you could say, right? Death of the, whatever, the hero-ish part of Superman.
And he certainly is no longer a presence in the world. Now he's just kind of hanging out on a farm, just being a normal person, right? Mm-hmm. So he has his kind of like, I just want to settle down and have a normal life, type thing.
But
that's how that story ends.
Never works out like that, right? Whenever the superhero wants to retire, something always brings them back. That one last, whatever.
That's true. Well, so fast forward half a decade or a decade, and you get the really iconic story of the death of Superman in the 90s. And the reason why I brought down this comic, the one that I showed Mike, but no one saw, was that there's this quote on the back of it that I'll read quick. By removing Superman from the equation, we, and the characters in the DC universe, learned how important Superman was as an icon. This storyline brought the real and fictional universes together in a stirring realization of just how much Superman means to our culture. That's from the wise people over at IGN.
Well,
gaming network, International Gaming Network. I'm not sure what IGN's been around forever. But it's a poignant quote. It's on the back of the comic, and so I was like, you know what, that's
And
actually
it
a really
very
good point
much
because
actually feeds into that Nietzsche God is dead idea. It's the God is dead and we killed him, where it's like, even if you didn't believe that God existed, but you kill the idea of God, what are the consequences of that going to be? And even though they don't literally kill the Superman in that world, the killing the idea of Superman, what are the consequences of that going to be?
well, and when the death of Superman happened back in the early 90s, DC definitely promoted it as a real thing, like a final thing. There was no
Mhm.
intimation that he was going to come back from the dead. So when people experienced this idea of the death of Superman in the early 90s, it felt final, right? They quickly undid it.
Hmm.
But nevertheless, the shock and awe of
Yeah.
Superman dying was very
Well,
real when it
and like I
happened
said,
in the
that's why I
90s.
shared with you. I can speak to that as a young kid, and having that
Mhm.
sense of shock when, wait, Superman dies, like seeing that comic cover, it was jarring, having grown up with, and I don't remember, I was probably, we'll just say 10 years old at the time or something.
Well, I tell you, it's actually really cool what they do in the comic because as that final fight's happening with Doomsday, the giant Hulk-like creature that is ultimately going to be responsible for Superman's death,
Hmm.
what they intentionally did is as the comic progresses, they kept making the image panels bigger and bigger so that by the time you get to, because the comic itself is basically just one big fight sequence,
Hmm.
but by the time you get to the end of the comic, you're looking at full page illustrations of the action that's happening instead of 6 or 7 boxes or panels taking up a page. They're just these giant splash pages of epic punching happening between him and Doomsday.
Yeah.
And then ultimately him being dead at the end, being cradled in Lois's arms as she's weeping, right? Which was a really brilliant
Well, like the
move from
Pieta, is
the
that kind of
creators.
is that what they were?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Like
It's super pietistic.
The
Yeah.
Michelangelo sculpture of Mary holding Jesus, which again,
Hmm.
we've refrained for about 15 minutes, but yes, he is a Christ figure in this Doomsday comic.
Sure
In
is.
this, and it was done on purpose, right? Lois is holding him like the Virgin, and the and in Jesus taken down from the cross. So
Well, and you know what's fascinating about what they do in the Death of Superman arc, and you've watched this animated movie now, so you can speak to it with relative accuracy because they do a good job of condensing 1,000 pages of comics because the aftermath of the Death of Superman actually lasted for a while,
mhm.
and there's a lot of content and all that, um, and they condensed that down pretty well
It
in the
translates
animated
really
movie.
well from the comic to the screen because it's an animated
Yeah,
version. But sorry, keep going.
but you have a bunch of pretenders. You
Yeah.
get a bunch of false Christs that show up, right?
Yep.
So the Jesus figure dies, right? And what's
There's
that
a vacuum.
phrase?
There's a power
So,
vacuum
yeah,
kind of.
power, yeah, abhors a
Oh,
what
nature
is it?
abhors a
A vac
vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum.
nature. That's what I'm thinking of. Yeah, but okay, yeah. So and so suddenly you have all these pretenders showing up. All these you could call them antichrist, basically. And they're varying degrees of actually evil or not, right? There's basically four, Eradicator, Superboy, Steel, Man of Steel,
Yeah.
and Cyborg Superman. And all four of them are, it's a big mystery. Part of the big plot, especially in the very, very, very long comic arc, is it takes a long time to resolve who are these people and who's the real
What's their
Superman and blah blah
motivations? And
blah.
yeah.
What's their motivations? In the animated movie, they get to that. You find out with relative quickness because it's only an hour and a half long, right?
And that
But
is, just to clarify, that's the sequel, The Reign of Superman, which again, it's
mhm.
tied up with the Death of Superman, the first movie. And this is 2018, 2019 is when these two are being made or released or whatever. But sorry, go ahead.
And I actually own. No, that's cool. I actually own a version. They did a version where they just combined them into one 3-hour animated movie.
Mm,
You know what
the
though?
Snyder cut.
That's the one. That's yeah, like a Snyder cut. That's the one that I bought the 3-hour combination to because I thought that I would appreciate that more. I kind of regret it. They kind of feel better as a just a movie
Two
about Superman's
chapters.
death.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then if they had done like an intermission thing in like the combined animated movie, I think that would have been effective because you kind of need that break after his
Oh,
death.
like the
Like you need like a
like the
moment of
Godfather when
silence.
the
You
yeah.
do. You absolutely do. Absolutely. Um, and when you combine them into one movie like that, it just kind of keeps the river just keeps flowing.
Hmm.
And it's like, but I kind of want to pause. I kind of need a little pause after he dies, kind of thing. So anyway, let that be a lesson to everyone. Go ahead and get like the 2 separate movies if you're so inclined.
And you can see them
But
separately on HBO Max, by the way, too.
yeah, there you go. HBO Max.
So,
Uh,
so what was the like? I guess we got a little bit into the mythology behind it. I mean, we've done sort of a synopsis of and talked about some of the symbolism in the death of Superman and then sort of the reign of Superman. But like, what's the kind of deeper like preceding mythology of this dying god that Superman is just another example of in this long line?
right. So this what we talked about before. And now people back in like the 19th century, right? The Golden Bough by Fraser. They made a big to do. It's like all of these kind of modern academics discovered that there's tons of dying and resurrecting gods
And that was
in
supposed to be like a
mythology.
gotcha to Christianity or something.
Yeah, it's like a gotcha moment. It's like, aha, as if
So-
anyone like forgot about
Which
these. It's like
again-
the whole world knew about these stories, but then all of a sudden you have these academics who just pretend they disappeared for 2,000 years. It's like, no, we always knew about them.
Mhm.
What's the problem here? Because just because there's a story about someone coming back from the dead, none of them are identical to what we claim about Jesus, right? They're just kind of shadows.
And none of them
They don't even
pretended
try to look
pretended
like
to be
what Jesus
history,
did.
whereas the
Right.
Gospels very much are. So
Yeah, so there's just no reason for us as Christians to be at all concerned about the prevalence of dying and resurrection motifs. I am always of the opinion that when you see a human story, like a monomythic story
Mhm.
that transcends culture and place, that just like when you find gravity everywhere, it just kind of means that, well, gravity must be
it speaks
authentic.
to the
There
truth
must
of
be
gravity.
something
It doesn't
real.
relativize gravity. It's
Yeah, it
just as
doesn't mean,
real.
oh, yeah,
just because
yeah.
you discovered something. So
If you find math in India, it just kind of means that math works everywhere and that math must be real, kind
so
of
yeah,
thing.
and it speaks to, and I mean, so and you're going to kind of go into this too of like C.S. Lewis drew upon this as it's very much tied in with C.S. Lewis's. You could kind of call it his argument from desire for God, in the sense of when you find this universal thing, whether it's a universal mythic story, universal, trope, universal, some universal truth, it doesn't relativize it. It actually it universalizes it. It makes it more
Mhm.
real. And
It makes it Catholic, right?
and well,
Like,
I mean, look, far be it from me to put words in your mouth, but but and so
I say the Nicene Creed. I
Yeah.
use the word Catholic.
yeah, lowercase c.
The real Nicene Creed too, none of that filioque stuff. but
That's
go
just
on.
the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed. Okay, just respect the next. Just respect the other ecumenical councils,
the
please.
new
Yeah, the 381 Council on the Holy Spirit. You got to get that Holy Spirit stuff in there. But
Uh-huh.
anyway, enough inside baseball. So, C.S. Lewis's, one of his big things when everybody loves talking about C.S. Lewis's arguments for God, and his big one, I mean, admittedly, it's very persuasive. His argument from desire is, and not that he invented it by any means, but we have this universal desire, right? Just like we have a universal desire to eat, it's because of the existence of food. And so in the same
if
way,
everyone feels hunger, it implies that there's a solution. Like if there's a universal need, then there's it's a need in search of an answer.
and you could apply
Right.
that same logic to the resurrection, even though you're only going to see shadows of it in like the Osiris myth or the Dionysus myth, or we kind of talked about in our underworld episode, Beowulf going down into the underworld and emerging victorious, right? We have this universal
Yep.
desire to conquer death, not just to get through it, not just to learn how to live with it. Ironically,
Well, and the reason why this isn't such a conversation about like a retread, I mean, certainly there's a lot of overlap. It's not really a retread of our descent into Hades episode
No.
because a lot of what we talked about in that episode was, either like humans or demi-humans, basically Joe Schmoes at least relative to like
The
people being
hero
gods or
as
whatever.
opposed to the god.
Yeah, as opposed to the god going into the underworld and coming back out and things like that. Um, Oftentimes semi-divine figures. Don't get me wrong, but
Hercules is another, yeah.
nevertheless,
So
exactly right. Um, but this is another facet, very similar to that relationship, that conversation, but it's another facet because what these stories are, is of a god, like a primal god, a god that's not just the progeny or of,
mhm.
a human and a god or something like that, um, being put to death, usually in some nasty way, oftentimes being just torn apart and dismembered, actually, as it turns out, and then being reassembled and brought back to life, and usually becoming the lord of the underworld in the process, right? Now, these are elements that we 100% ascribe to Christ, as far as like when he enters into death, he becomes Lord of Death. And if you look at a classical icon of the resurrection, it's the shattered doors of Hades under the feet of Jesus in the shape of a cross,
Mm.
and him pulling Adam and Eve out of the abyss, out of the
The
darkness.
heroine of
But
hell.
he is
Yeah.
the heroine of hell, exactly. And he's a triumphant king. He is the Lord of the underworld now.
One of the
So
Oh, go ahead.
go
Sorry.
on.
So
No, so that's a definitely motif.
well, and I wanted to bring up because it's not given very much attention because of all the other really cool stuff happening in the Inferno, in Dante's Inferno, in the Divine Comedy. But there are a lot of sort of like throwaway lines, passing references to different elements of Inferno that are destroyed. Because what Dante's doing is he's kind of mixing together the mythological underworld and the hell of the damned. And so when Christ
Mhm.
conquered the underworld, there's a lot of like there's a destroyed bridge that happened when Christ went into hell, went into the underworld and destroyed death.
Sure,
And
sure.
so you have these little things where like, oh, Virgil says, oh yeah, we can't go that way because that thing was destroyed, or this thing. And it's like, well, how does that just happen? But it's a reference to the heroine of hell.
Oh, I got it. Voyage Comics, Corporate Overlords. You need to do a prequel to the Divine Comedy. It's going to be brilliant. A prequel to the Divine Comedy that follows Jesus harrowing hell, because the Inferno is the only part of the Divine Comedy that anyone cares about anymore.
Unfortunately,
Is all the metal
yeah.
imagery.
We love
Isn't that true?
No, unfortunately that gets
Yeah.
way too
Well,
much attention when
we're
Purgatorio
fascinated
and
by it.
Paradiso are
Yeah.
like they're such gems.
Regulated.
I mean,
Yeah. But there you go. Boom.
Jacob,
That's a gift.
there's
Voyage
already,
Comics.
you know
can
that
have
there's
that
an
one.
Orthodox comic of the heroine of hell already that exists. We've talked about this before. There already is.
I own it.
Yeah,
I got
I was
it.
going to say, we've
I
talked
got
about
it.
this.
No. But I am specifically. We need to market this as the prequel
Well,
to
it's based
the
off of
Divine
that. It's based off of that
Comedy.
line in First Peter where Jesus preaches to the souls in prison that Saint Peter talks about.
Absolutely.
I think it's First Peter like 3:21 or something, but something like that, 3:19.
I just don't think that you are taking seriously this, blockbuster idea. But I guess we'll leave that up to the corporate overlords. But
Oh,
anyway,
Jacob, you got cut out. You're gone. What happened? Oh,
yeah, right.
back to Superman.
So yeah, no. Anyway, so when we're talking about these gods dying and coming back to life, becoming Lord of the Underworld kind of thing, what that meant in practice for a lot of the cultures that had these stories, they were tethering it to the fertility and the coming back of the seasons and things like that.
Yeah.
So if you look at a story like Osiris in Egypt, and a lot of these Levant cultures, right, especially the ones that are on the Nile banks and things like that, but these like flood seasons and things where they really needed that to like bring the world back from the dead, because it was like a scorched wasteland until like the floodwaters came. And that 100% plays into Noah's, like the typology of Noah's flood, where like the world gets cleansed but then life comes back from the flood kind of thing. I mean, I think we could totally have a whole conversation
Life-giving
about that some other
waters,
episode.
purifying of sin.
Life-giving waters.
It's like,
Where have I
gosh,
heard
is there
that
a
before?
baptism imagery going on with the flood?
Yeah,
Imagine who could have
exactly.
made that connection,
Who knows? But this idea of the spring as such is the experience of the resurrection of these gods in these myths, right? And so let's see here. I got a little list here. We got Osiris, we got Dionysius, we got the Babylonian god Tammuz, which I guess is just a Babylonian version of, Adonis or something like that. Adonis?
I would
Adonis,
pronounce
that's the way
Adonis,
you say it.
but I'm not going to correct
Yeah,
you.
Adonis, you're right. No, that's right. You got it. Or at least I got it. No thanks to you.
You know when anybody ever asks me how to pronounce something, and I did steal this from Lord of Spirits, they always just say, just with confidence. That's always the answer. That's my favorite. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, that's good advice. So these people, we experience that. And, when it comes to the Lenten season, right? I think this is beautiful about the liturgical calendar of the church, where people feel this, like seasonal depressive disorder, whatever it's called. Like, when people kind of get sad in the wintertime,
Mhm.
when there's like a lack of sun and things like that, or a lack of warmth, it's really, really natural for us to experience seasons because we are embodied creatures, and like we really are tethered to this. Kind of goes into themes that we will discuss when it comes to like nature and things like that when we get into episodes like that. But like we are in the ecosystem, right? And we are a part of creation. And so you have like this seasonal mood disorder that occurs. And Lent just means spring, right? That it's just a word for spring. Um and so when we talk about the approach of Lent as Christians, and for us it's a season of repentance, right? But it's because we know that the resurrection's coming, and we know that the summer is coming, and the Son of Righteousness, S-U-N, is a phrase we use in the Orthodox Church. I'm sure it's in the Catholic Church too, where summertime, the resurrection, the glory and the warmth and the greenery of summer, you know, that's very much in the DNA of the liturgical calendar, right? And it's not, we don't do it because of that. We do it because of the historicity of when Christ was
Well, yeah,
crucified and things
the
like
myth
that.
and the history are
But
not in conflict. They supplement each other.
but they're not in conflict.
Right.
They 100%. It's almost like it happened for a reason.
Mhm.
It's almost like this is all
It's the
kind of part of the plan.
It's the convergence of myth and history, which, going back to our C.S. Lewis thing, that was one of the big things that led to his conversion, is his conversation with Tolkien, where it's the myth that was true. And because the myth was more convincing, but it just also happened to be true.
And what is it? I think that he was actually throwing a lot of the cool Corn King, because that's like Lewis's little pet name for this Frasier-esque dying and resurrection fertility god, seasonal cycle deity thing, Corn Kings, right? And I think that's what Lewis was throwing at Tolkien. Oh, Jesus is just another Corn King.
Well, and it kind of ties into
Tolkien's like, he's not just another Corn King. He is the Corn King, of which all those other Corn Kings are just
and this is why it has to be the dying god. And going back to why it has to be Superman that dies. Well, it might be significant that, Batman or Flash or Wonder Woman dies. It has to be Superman in order to fit into this, because it's just like going back to these ancient communities where it's like you want to find a natural explanation of, oh yeah, the seasons change, winter kills everything and then it all comes back in the spring or whatever. It has to be the life giver. So the life giver for the community, which for the Egyptians was the Nile. And so it has to be the death of God in order for this renewal, in order for this to kind of like, I guess, have the effect or have the significance,
Well, in our perennial obsession with telling Superman death stories in the last 40 years or whatever, right?
Yeah.
I think that in some sense it's actually a reference to it's like we're going back into our primal need for the resurrected God, because we're living in this kind of liquid modernity, this kind of deconstructed, unmythic world, right? The God is dead thing that Nietzsche ushered in, right? For, Superman existed for 60 years and no one ever thought of killing him, right? But these innate archetypal tales, stories that live within us, rise to the surface when we need them, basically, right? They'll always come back out like they're reborn, actually, to use that metaphor.
Well, we got sick of killing the real God because we turned away and ignored the real dying God in Jesus. And so we had to start recreating our own. And like you said, we're not
Well-
even recreating it because Superman had been around for a long time, but we have to recreate the dying God. So we have to kill Superman, or we have to deconstruct the superhero in general.
And there's something, you know, to your points, like, because what you said was that, like, you gotta kill the life giver, right? Which I do think is very mythic. That's totally true. When we talk about Superman, it's understood. He is the most godlike
Yeah.
superhero character. He's also the most archetypal superhero character, as in he's the first and ultimately the source of superheroes as such in the comic world, in modernity, right?
And he's the one that most
is the
resembles a
original.
god. Like, okay, I mean, if
He's
anything,
all powerful.
we talked about how the Flash is more reminiscent of like Mercury, but Mercury wasn't the all powerful, you know?
Mhm.
And like Batman might
Absolutely.
be more reminiscent of Orpheus, but Orpheus wasn't even Hades wasn't the all powerful, you know?
Mhm. Well, no, Superman lives on top of the world in his fortress of solitude, right? He stands alone on top of the planet at the top, right?
He's
Mount
literally
Olympus, you know,
otherworldly.
imagery of being at the top of things, right? He is so everyone thinks of Superman as being the strongest creature in existence, and he basically is, right? It's funny when they created Doomsday is basically just kind of like a Hulk ripoff. He's got kind of a fascinating backstory as to like where he came from.
It's
but he
Hulk
was created to
with
be
spikes though. Hulk with spikes. That's
Hulk
totally
with
different.
spikes,
Yeah.
100, totally different, and he's gray. Oh shoot, Hulk was gray for a while too. Dang it! But he's got those spikes.
And they grow.
And so if you ever want to, you know, sometimes it's like who would win in a fight, Hulk or Superman? And it's like, well, they just kill each other. So we've seen it. It's in the death of Superman. But you know, and then through shenanigans, it's funny to see how Superman gets brought back to life in all these stories. It's always unconvincing, basically, but
Well, yeah,
you got to bring him back
it's
somehow.
like arbitrary or whatever. It just kind of happens, which maybe somebody could argue, oh, well, isn't the resurrection of Jesus just arbitrary because it's like a wish fulfillment thing? But
Yeah, right. I mean, if you truly understand what's being told in the Christian story, it's an inevitability, right? Like there's nothing, and that's what's so
you
cohesive
got to
and
snap
beautiful
your
about
fingers
it.
when you do that, by the way. It's inevitable.
I am an inevitable, right? Yeah, where's my big golden jeweled glove? Um, you know, like it all makes sense, right? Whereas something like Superman being brought back to the dead is just another shadow of that. And as such, it's not as good, ultimately, narratively, cohesively speaking.
Well-
But it's iconic for sure, right?
And to go back to the thing that we've kind of been circling around this idea of why it has to be Superman, and you said because he's the most archetypal, and to coin a new word, he's the most patriarchetypal, because because what is his it's truth, justice, and the American way. And so when
Yeah.
you kill Superman,
He walked away from that in the 2000s because whatever.
But
anyway,
but
go
yeah,
on.
no, but again, this, you know, like in 92, the death of Superman, like this precedes it, of course.
Yeah.
And so like, what are we killing when we kill Superman? Is it this sort of death of, you know, America as so many people had seen it or how so many people had known it? Is in there again, it's like, is it the death of truth, the death of justice, death of the American way? What are the consequences of it? Right? Go back to our Nietzsche thing of God is dead and we killed him. Again, whether you believed in God or not, the idea of God being dead is going to have consequences. And so go ahead.
And the pretenders show up, right?
Yeah.
The pretenders show up. So when you kill the mythology, you got to replace the mythology with a new mythology. And I think that's 100% what you see in our culture nowadays. When you remove Christianity from the public, and you're talking about the American culture, because, you know, again, ever the culture warrior, Mike.
Yeah.
You know,
That's where the clicks are, man.
Yeah, that's right. You see new narratives being put forward in the same way. And so, like, if you look at the death of Superman storyline, all these different pretenders to the throne are imperfect, right? Like, Superboy is an angsty teen. You know, Cyborg Superman's actually just crazy and homicidal. The Eradicator is like this weird Kryptonian tech, basically, that's meant to like protect Superman as he like comes back to life. And Man of Steel is just a dude on the street that gets inspired by Superman and just kind of like he's not wearing
Just a
hockey
dude on the
pads
street, you
type
said?
thing.
Yeah, like kind of the
He
Yeah.
is, yeah. Like he is even more so in the comics. In the movie, they make him into more of like a scientist guy. I think the animated.
well, he
movie,
like it's like an Iron Man with a hammer.
he is like Iron
Yeah.
Man. Yeah, he is a very Iron Man-esque character. But his backstory is that he just wants to like step up because Superman's not there no more, and there's really not much more to it than that.
Mm.
It makes him very heroic. He's a cool character, but yeah, there's nothing really flashy.
I also
there.
got a
And
sense
anyway,
of like
he's
a
not
John Henry thing going on. I mean, maybe it's just the hammer.
super John
right?
Henry.
But
No, well, honestly, I think his name's John Henry.
oh, that's probably
too.
it. Yeah.
They literally,
So-
call him John
they
Henry.
just like
so
it's like they're just
very
so
John
they wanted to
Henry.
incorporate some of that American mythology, tall tales.
Yeah,
sort of thing in there,
absolutely,
too.
absolutely.
I knew I had thought that somewhere, but
He
yeah.
doesn't get enough. He doesn't get enough credit as he's kind of like the pretender Superman that nobody cares about because he's just not quite as interested. He doesn't have cool yellow visors like Eradicator.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
doesn't have a cool leather jacket like Punk Superboy.
Yeah, I remember that one being a little
Um,
off-putting, but
Yeah. He's got an earring in his ear.
it's like, well, it's like
tell
it's
you.
like Robin that can fly, sort of, is what I kind of
Yeah,
the vibe I got, so.
yeah. Anyway, but we haven't even gotten to my favorite. You know, I know we're running out of time on this episode. We never even got to All Star Superman, which is
By all means.
my favorite version of this story. Where basically Grant Morrison's the author of that one. The best way to understand Grant Morrison, he was a modern comic writer, but he traveled to the future from the 1960s, where he, under various pseudonyms, must have created all those other wacky comics in the 60s where like Superman's, you know, whatever, fighting giant pinball machines or whatever he's doing. Grant Morrison loves that type of stuff. And so whenever you read a Grant Morrison comic book these days, it's always incredibly imaginative and really rooted in like the wacky side, like the kind of Batman 66 side.
Like a surrealist Superman. You gotta.
It is kind of it's very whimsical.
Okay.
Grant Morrison is a super whimsical comic writer. And so DC had this thing where they were doing these all-star lines where they wanted these one-off comics that were just like they put, you know, really interesting writer with an artist together to create this kind of like seminal work kind of thing. So Grant Morrison creates All-Star Superman. And it's a really, really, it's ironic. When I was telling Mike, what I would recommend he watch, he went with Death of Superman. And because that's the iconic one. That's the iconic one. But All-Star Superman's the better story.
Okay.
It's a better movie, frankly. So go watch it sometime. But it's very whimsical, and Superman's known for being the strong man, like the strongest being in the universe.
Okay.
But he's also hyper intelligent, like especially in Grant Morrison, characterization of the character. The same powers, like the same sun that strengthens his like cells to be like super strong cells.
Okay.
It does the same thing to his brain.
Mm.
So he's got like a super brain. And so he's actually, I was getting to this when we were talking about how he's godlike. He's not all intelligent, but he's hyper intelligent.
Yeah.
He's also hyper humble though, right? So he's basically just kind of like perfect, right? In that story, in All-Star Superman, he gets corrupted. He basically gets super infused with sun power, but it's too much for even him to process, like metabolize. And so he's dying. The entire comic story is him finding out at the beginning of the story that he's got only so many months to live. He's basically given cancer, more or less, like Superman cancer. And the rest of the story is him trying to wrap up his life before the end, right?
Because there again,
and it's really well told.
You got to come to grips with mortality, even if you're Superman.
Yep. It is it's that story. That's the story. It's like, how does Superman deal with his own death? Because in Death of Superman, he doesn't have a chance to ruminate on it. He just is reacting to doomsday. And in All-Star Superman, he never actually dies anyway. But even in that one, or not All-Star, but whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow, not only does he not actually die at the end, but it's really not about him. It's about him hanging up the Superman mantle more than anything. Though he is afraid of dying, because he gets basically intimations that people from the future tell him or hint that he's going to die in Man of Tomorrow. And so he has that kind of like fear going on. All-Star Superman's an entire comic story about him and not being afraid of death either, frankly, because he's too good. Grant Morrison leans into Superman being truly the Boy Scout. He's just too good. And it ends on a very poignant note. You know, at the end, he has to go fix the sun because shenanigans, and the sun's going to go out. And so Superman has all this sun power in him. And so he says goodbye to Lois, you know,
kind of a
gives her a kiss
theosis
goodbye.
going on, actually. Now I'm kind of picking up
It
hints
is.
of...
It's very, yeah, because here's the thing, and this is to your point. He's dying, and like he's at death's door at this point, but he's got just enough strength to like fly to the sun. And so he says, "I love you, Lois. I'll always love you." And he flies to the sun, right? And he disappears into the sun. And then there's an epilogue where Jimmy Olsen's talking to Lois, and Lois is like, he's not dead. He's just up there fixing the sun. And when he's done fixing the sun, he'll come back. Like a once and future king type motif.
Yeah.
And the final panel is this almost Art Deco. You know that like
I wanted to name this episode
Rockefeller?
Superman is Dead, Long Live Superman too. And you just fed right into it. Like, sorry, go ahead. The Art Deco.
You know, like Rockefeller Center, like the rink, they have that like Prometheus statue.
Yep.
Or I'm actually mixing this up. But like there's like this idea of like it's almost like it's an image of Superman pulling a big lever. And it's kind of Art Deco-y looking. The final panel after Lois Lane talks about him fixing the sun and coming back is this artistic, stylized image of Superman pulling a lever, like in the sun kind of thing, like fixing the sun.
Maybe you can just show it to me across the screen so nobody else can see it.
I didn't bring that comic with me. Google it. Final panel of All-Star Superman. Or whatever. All-Star Superman.
Oh, it kind of makes me think of like
it?
at like a train station.
Because he becomes a star.
Like, you know, like it actually kind of makes me think of like a communist propaganda poster or something.
It is. No, that's actually 100%. It looks like communist.
Like
that type
like,
of like
yeah, like the
imagery.
glory of the worker. It kind of just makes me think of or something like that.
Well, and you know, famously Superman kind of started as like
well, it's like anti-Nazi, anti-communist, like it was truth, justice,
well,
and the American way.
he was kind of a socialist icon in the 30s. Like he was.
Oh, I see.
He's there to like fight against like the big wigs, the capitalist big wigs.
Oh, okay.
For the little guy.
Yeah.
But then World War II happens, and then he becomes anti-communist. So.
Gotcha.
But
no, I did find it.
There's a whole thing called Red Sun, where it's an Elseworlds tale where he lands in Russia instead of Kansas. And becomes like the hero of the communist Russian.
I saw
Soviets.
that one was advertised on HBO Max too. I haven't watched.
There's a ton.
I didn't watch that one.
Hey, I'm just gonna throw a pitch out there for the DC animated universe. No, all of it's on HBO Max,
and because it follows,
there's a ton of good content.
Because it translates from the comics so well. It actually, like the Batman ones, the Superman ones, they are entertaining and well made. Like.
We never got around to talking about the Snyderverse, and like because that's the other big storyline of Superman.
Well, we made jokes about it. Isn't that what's most important?
We're gonna do an entire episode in which I redeem the Snyderverse. I'm the only person on the planet. I am like Maximus Confessor, or Athanasius.
Are you thinking of Athanasius? Because
no, Maximus too.
Okay.
Only. Yeah, Mike's gonna come cut out my tongue and cut off my
But the phrase is
hand,
Athanasius contra mundi. So,
Athanasius, against the world, right? I am Jacob defending the Snyderverse against the world, even though I don't even like it as much as I want to like it because it does have flaws. But people seem to really they have dismissed it so profoundly.
Well, I thought,
and it's like, listen, folks, there's a ton of stuff to talk about in these movies, but. Anyway, that's the death of Superman story. And it's got really, really interesting things going along as long as you watch the right versions. Because the studios really, really messed these up. The studios were trying to be like, oh no, Zack Snyder is doing something that does not look like what Marvel is doing. And they were right, because frankly, Marvel's strategy was better at the end of the day. And they've done a really good job with their movies. But Zack Snyder was not doing that. And so Warner Brothers was like, we're going to interfere with this. And so they derailed him. But and then through a miracle of miracles, talk about resurrections, the Snyder Cut of Justice League actually happens. That is such a profoundly strange thing that occurred. It's like you get a bunch of people on the internet who just like petitioned enough to actually get a 4-hour complete with reshoots and better CG version of this movie. I think it was Warner Brothers mea culpa. Yeah, we screwed up Justice League. Okay, Zack Snyder, go ahead. Show them what you really wanted to show them. But anyway, you watch Man of Steel, followed by Batman v Superman. It's such a stupid title.
Dawn of Justice.
The extended cut. The extended cut. And then Zack Snyder's Justice League, which is a grand. It's like 10 hours. No, it's like 10 hours of content, right? But if you watch that 10 hours of content all the way through, you will see what Snyder's vision
It's just
was.
so
like
long
what Snyder
because it's all in
was
slow
trying to
motion,
create.
right?
That's true. There's a lot
I've
of
actually
slow
made that
motion.
joke on this podcast before.
You can keep
I
making
know,
it because
yeah,
it
it's just
still holds up.
It's evergreen, right? It's perennial. It's
Yeah, it is. It is also perennial, like Superman deaths.
yeah.
And I tell you what, man, it's an interesting
Superman,
story. If you take it on
quote
its own
unquote
merits,
deaths,
it's an interesting
'cause,
story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even when Superman dies, he doesn't really die. And that's and that's one of the things too, is like, as much as we want to recreate these myths, we still can't quite go that full, like we can't go a full 100% on it, and
Mhm.
maybe I'm opening up too much. Maybe I'm opening up a can of worms or whatever too late but I'm just thinking, like, that's one of the things that really stuck with me when I watched Death of Superman and then started watching Reign of Superman, is like, or like you were saying in the comic too, is even when he's dead, he's not really dead. And I'm not dismissing the importance of like the death of the icon and how significant that was in the storyline, but it's just funny how like we still can't grapple with actual death in our heroes, in our gods, right? And yet that's
Sure.
what makes Christianity different, is no, we didn't just pretend. Not only do we not pretend that Jesus rose, but we can't even pretend that Jesus didn't die. Like we have to go full 100 all the way through. He actually died, he was actually dead, and he actually rose. And all the other stuff too, of course.
That's super important that we kind of leave that final note for this conversation, is that we've been talking a lot about this dying, resurrecting God idea, but none of it, I mean, like, Jesus really does die.
It's all just shadows compared to the reality.
It is. It's just intimations, and that's the word of this podcast, intimations. I've used it like 3 times now. But like it's and yet this is what makes Christianity truly great, right? One of the things, folks, that you can be proud of if you're a Christian, and you can hopefully be intrigued by if you're not, is that not only is our religion cool, which it is, but it's profound in how it has the best of all things.
And it doesn't escape.
wrapped up
It's
in it.
not escapism, as much as even
None of
somebody
it.
like
None of it.
Nietzsche or Schopenhauer or all those other, salty atheists might say, like, it's not escapism. It enters into the pain and the death.
The death of Superman feels cheap because they're going to bring him back, right? The death of Jesus doesn't feel cheap because him coming back is the point, and like it's all like none of it is. It is all part of the plan, right? Whereas when you bring Superman back, you're basically just undoing a decision you made previously because, commerce.
We all
ultimately.
roll our eyes at the retcon. We all roll our eyes
right?
at it.
Whereas the narrative structure of Jesus, it has way more to do, frankly. Even though we did the whole Descent into Hades thing, we kind of leaned more on like the stories of like humans going into the underworld and things like that. But if anything, if there's a better correlation, it is the fertility seasonal gods, because at least there you're talking about it being this kind of cosmic story that
the grain of wheat
they're personifying
has to fall to the earth and die, right? To quote John
in
chapter
order
12,
for more fruit.
right? And
Boom.
so that's
Nice.
So thank you, Jacob, for suggesting this, for insisting on this, for putting in so much of that background work. Now you can be maybe a little more appreciative of your noble co-hosts, all the effort that goes into these sorts of episodes and stuff. But we want to thank all you guys for coming to listen, just so that you can keep Jacob and I coming back over and over again. Right.
Nice.
Each time, isn't it?
I like what you did there.
I know. So, and just want to encourage you guys to, again, subscribe to the show, leave a 5-star rating, positive review, because we do want to keep coming back and doing this, talking about all the really, profound symbolism, all the profound themes that connect the pop culture that we love, the ancient and modern mythology, to our Christian faiths.
We fight for truth, justice, in the Voyage Comics way.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.